Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. We are excited about this webinar that our Education Resource Working Group has put together for you. The U.S. Catholic Sisters Against Human Trafficking's mission is to end human trafficking and to lift up survivors. So we thank you for being a part of this and educating, taking an hour out of your day to get educated on this very, very important issue of Native American Indigenous communities and how they are vulnerable to human trafficking. So I would love to start off with Sister Teresa Ann Wolf. She is a part of the U.S. Catholic Sisters Against Trafficking, and she's going to start us off today with a prayer.
Hello, this is a prayer, a Native American prayer that was translated by Chief Yellow Lark in 1887. So we have prayed this continually since then. Great Spirit Prayer. O Great Spirit, whose voice I hear in the winds, and whose breath gives life to all the world. Hear me. I need your strength and wisdom. Let me walk in beauty and make my eyes ever hold the red and purple sunset. Make my hands respect the things you have made, and my ears sharp to hear your voice. Make me wise, so that I may understand the things you have taught my people. Let me learn the lessons you have hidden in every leaf and rock. Help me remain calm and strong in the face of all that comes towards me. Help me find compassion without empathy overwhelming me. I seek strength not to be greater than my brother, but to fight my greatest enemy, myself. Make me always ready to come to you with clean hands and straight eyes. So when life fades as the fading sunset, my spirit may come to you without shame. Amen.
Thank you, sister. That was beautiful. Next, I would like to introduce Felicitas Brugo Onetti. She is also a member of the U.S. Catholic Sisters Against Trafficking and works for the USCCB. Thanks for being here, Felicitas.
Of course, thanks for having me. So my name is Felicitas Brugo. I am the Anti-Trafficking Education and Outreach Coordinator for the Department of Migration and Refugee Services here at USCCB. And I will be one of the panelists today, along with Father Michael Carson, which is the Assistant Director, Secretary of Cultural Diversity in the Church at USCCB as well, and Father David Bailey from the Diocese of Tyler. So I'll let them introduce themselves a little more.
Father Carson, you want to introduce yourself, or you want me to introduce you, or you want to introduce me, or how do you want to do that?
I will introduce myself. I'm Father Michael Carson. I'm the Assistant Director of Native American Affairs for the Secretariat of Cultural Diversity at the USCCB. I'm the staff person to the Subcommittee Native American Affairs. We have 6 bishops on our subcommittee. This is policy for everything Native American. I also do a lot of coordination of missions, churches and schools, mostly on reservations, but those who cater to the Native American population. I do a lot of coordination with national Catholic Native organizations. That's me.
Father David Bailey. I'm a priest of the Diocese of Tyler in Northeast Texas. We share a border with Oklahoma. I spend quite a bit of time there, usually a couple times a year, in the Diocese of Tulsa, primarily Oklahoma. We're also just north of the Alabama Coshada Reservation, but going back to the mid-1990s, I've had a working relationship with various Native communities and families and friends from different tribes and reservations throughout Indian country, primarily in Montana, also South Dakota, quite a lot in Oklahoma, as I mentioned, and continue to speak out as an advocate for Native issues here as a pastor of Holy Family Catholic Church in Lindale, Texas.
Wonderful. So I think if you can share your screen, Father David, and you can get us started.
I can share my screen.
Yeah, I think you should have access for.
It's not necessary.
Oh, okay.
I'm not doing a PowerPoint.
Okay, great.
Okay, well, thank you for inviting me to be a part of this. I'm really grateful to be able to discuss these issues. And, we're going to take a three-pronged approach here to discussing the issue with Father Carson coming in and talking about some of the legislation and things like that that have come about in the past years. But I wanted to start by doing a basic historical overview of the problem of sexual exploitation and human trafficking pertaining to Native communities. In the Western Hemisphere, the abduction, commercial exploitation, and murder of Native women literally goes back to the very beginning of first contact between Europeans and Native people. The selling of North America's indigenous women and children for sexual purposes has been an ongoing practice since the colonial era. And this is evidence given by several early British surveyors who viewed Native women and their supposed sexual reproductive freedom as proof of their innate impurity, and therefore, with that, assumed the right to kidnap, to rape, to prostitute Native women and girls without consequence. And part of the reason for that, and other Europeans that came over had the same derogatory attitudes, and part of the reason for that is simply this: there was always an inherent sense of superiority on the part of Europeans looking to conquer and pillage any civilization they could anytime they were able. And more than enough evidence supports this fact. Even in Europe, you can look at the Vikings and what they did during the brief period that they occupied what is now called England, or the barbarian hordes when they ransacked Rome at the fall of Rome. Such behavior continued into the New World, and consequently, such actions decimated many Native communities with kidnapping and slavery, which was introduced from the very first moment of contact between natives and their European visitors. And to understand just how vile natives were looked at by Europeans, there is the great example is the Mohawk word. It's Otisisqua or Ojisqua, depending on your pronunciation. And there's divided opinion among some scholars who some believe say that the word squaw actually comes from the Mohawk word Otisqua, Otisisqua, or Ojisqua, depending on your pronunciation. So for context, right, Mohawks live in the northeastern part of the United States, what would have been New England, and also southern Ontario. So they currently have a reservation in New York called St. Regis, or in their language, Akwesasne. That's upstate New York. And so this would have been one of the first communities that would have been visited upon first contact. And so back in those days, remember that fur trading, trapping, and various things was quite lucrative in the United States and Canada. And not surprisingly, the world's oldest profession was also on offer when Native women who had been stolen from their families were traded in the trading posts for money. It's not known how many Mohawk women specifically were numbered in old world sex trafficking, but there is strong evidence that there were quite a few. And so you can imagine how devastated they would have been upon hearing themselves referred to as a squaw repeatedly day after day, because after all, the word Otisisqua, Otsisqua, or Ojisqua in their language translates to vagina. Mohawk women would have known without any doubt or sugarcoating what their value was, and such humiliation was only compounded by the trauma of being kidnapped from home and forced into prostitution. There are others who believe that the SQ word, which I like to avoid as often as possible, takes its origin from the Cree language. Their word for woman or women is Sisqua or Isqua. Regardless of where the word comes from, it is still wildly derogatory, as it has been perpetuated throughout the generations, stereotypical notions of Native women where you have the princess, the Indian princess in one corner versus the squaw in another. On the other hand, with the princess You have Eurocentric values championed as a model for perfect behavior, while the squaw, quotation fingers, is given far less consideration. So an example of these dueling notions can be found in a shocking by our standards today, but normal by their standards, article printed in the Omaha Herald on the 4th of November, 1876. And they were reporting an event in which a Lakota war leader by the name of American Horse, with an entourage of women and children, were coming to visit a fort. And the article read this, and again, I'm using terms that we don't use anymore, and I apologize because it is offensive, but this is what they said in the newspaper, mainstream media. And you see the idea of how natives were looked at by non-natives. The article says this: American Horse and his squaw and papoose, by which they mean child, were with him, and there were 11 other squaws in the party. One or two were quite pleasing in the face, but the majority looked as though they were natural-born mothers-in-law. Perhaps this is too severe. They all had the appearance of being amiable at times, and the Herald does not wish to say anything really bad about them. Now note the difference in language here between the next paragraph, in which they refer to the officers' wives. Several ladies passed through, two of whom were evidently officers' wives and somewhat acquainted with the Indian language and customs. The Indians seemed delighted to see these white ladies and took pains to shake hands with them. American Horse's papoose was a chubby, sturdy little beggar, and when one of the ladies spoke to him, he set up a tremendous wail, just as natural and lifelike as if he were human. As if he were human. Here we get to the heart of the matter. Respect for the dignity of the human person was never, or at least very rarely, ever applied to members of First Nations communities. And if you can discount the dignity of natives in general, and then you furthermore view Native women as being immoral, then you see why there were never any qualms about stealing, trading, and selling Native women for commercial sexploitation. Unfortunately, society has not learned their lesson, because we still see highly romanticized depictions of Native women in a manner which is meant to entice. Take Pocahontas, for example. In reality, she was a teenage girl, like a 14, 15-year-old girl. But if you look at the Disney depiction from the movie, she looks like a fully developed woman. Native women, again, are either depicted as the beautiful princess with European manners, or the squaw whose only value is the anatomical region of their body by which conception is possible, and nothing more. And this is one reason why cartoon depictions of Native women are problematic. Even when there is an honest attempt at flattery, it continues to perpetuate stereotypes that the sole purpose of a Native woman is to seduce non-Native men. According to Lisa Brunner of the National Indigenous Women's Resource, Native women experience violent victimization at a rate higher than any other U.S. demographic. Congressional findings are that more than 1 in 3 Native American or Alaskan Native women will be raped in their lifetime. More than 6 in 10 will be physically assaulted. Native women are stalked more than twice the rate of other women, and Native women are murdered at more than 10 times the national average. And non-Native men commit 88% of violent crimes against Native women. In the United States and Canada, there is no one more vulnerable than a Native female aged 15 to 24 years old. And perhaps the most horrific of all these cases is a case I really hate talking about. It just gets me every single time. And I apologize in advance, because what you're about to hear is grisly. The most horrific example of all these cases, in my opinion, is the grisly murder of the 19-year-old Helen Betty Osborne, a tribal member of the Kenotsai-Sipi Cree Nation in Manitoba, Canada. Her body was found in November 1971 after being abducted by 4 Caucasian men who stripped her naked, savagely abused her, and, holy Jesus, stabbed her 50 times with a screwdriver. Before killing her, they took her to a lake house belonging to the family of one of the assailants. And while there, they spent hours taking turns beating her while the others watched, while taking their turn and drinking beer, according to at least one account. Eventually, she was transported to another location where her life was cruelly taken from her by a screwdriver. And yet, despite all the obvious evidence pointing to the identity of her killers, including the men themselves boasting in public how they'd gotten away with murder, the case remained unsolved for almost 20 years. And only one of the 4 men responsible did any time in prison, and he only received a 10-year sentence. More than 5,700 Native women have been reported as missing and or murdered, and yet many more go unreported. The numbers are actually a lot higher. And only recently has the MMIW, or Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women movement, begun to gain attention. But it's been a long, hard battle with many tragic cases before mainstream society in the United States and Canada began to take notice. Recently, on the 1st of January 2020, a 16-year-old member of the Crow Nation of Montana stopped at a rest stop on her way home from a New Year's party. She was next seen 13 days later. Her body was 1.5 miles from the rest stop in the grass. They said that she froze to death, but no one's convinced. Her name was Selena Not Afraid. 6 months after the death of Selena Not Afraid, I was in Montana visiting friends from 2 of the nearby reservations. There actually are 7 reservations in the state of Montana. I was visiting friends from 2 of those reservations, and before the end of the day, I went to the third of 7, the Crow Reservation, where I stopped into the town of Gary Owen, which is where Highway 212 and I-90 intersect, and that's actually where the Little Bighorn Battlefield is, which is a tourist attraction. You can still see, as you're driving by, the Little Bighorn Battlefield Monument, which sits as a reminder to all those who pass by of not too distant conflicts between white and red and the blood that was shed. A different war is being waged today, but the target is the same. Native women are victims of violence on an astronomical level, and the vast majority of their perpetrators are non-Native males. And so as I was there on this particular day, I was thinking of Selena Not Afraid. And I was only 45 miles west from where 2 Northern Cheyenne girls were found, Henny Scott and Hannah Harris. And it was only 20 miles east from where a Crow tribal member, Kesara Stops Pretty Places, was located after her dead body, had been exposed to everybody that could see in the backyard of a residential area for 2 days. In this part of Montana and this part of the world, missing and murdered Indigenous women and that plight is a lingering reality for everyone in that area. And so I topped off my gas tank and got on the road, and I drove for 47 miles on I-90 before arriving at the last place Selena Not Afraid was seen alive. Surveying a cluster of trees and a rising hillside not far from the parking lot, I wondered what was going through her mind during those last moments of her life. All I could do in a place like that was to pray in the sincere hope that there will be no more Selenas. But the statistics say that there will be, and in fact, there have been since. And most pictures of Selena Not Afraid posted online after her death, she was smiling. Google them, Selena Not Afraid. 3 words, Selena Not Afraid. Google them. She's a beautiful, smiling girl. And as I sat there at the last place she was seen alive, I simply could not comprehend why anyone would take that smile away. And yet, this is what happened. This is what happened, and what continues to happen time and time and time and time again. And so, standing there, I prayed for an end to violence against women while watching the wind shift through the grass and the trees in the same location where this frightened girl ran for her life in freezing weather. Something, or someone scared her enough to keep her in hiding until her body's core temperature became so low she succumbed to the black cloak of death. She was last seen running toward the trees, and those same trees nodded in the breeze before me as I surveyed the place where the ghost of a 16-year-old Crow girl cries out for justice, pleading for the end of the cancer which consumed her, the foul, dark wind that canceled all of her future plans. Driving away from what I called Selena's last exit, the sky opened up with rains of lamentations because even the landscape and all natural creation seemed to be in mourning. Murder is unnatural. The murder of youth unconscionable. The clouds, the earth, and all living creatures in unison with me that day howled in anger over the destruction of life and hope and love and the desecration of innocence. All of us, every single one of us, are created in the image and likeness of God, the Imago Dei. And in the Summa Theologia, St. Thomas Aquinas lists 3 ways in which we are created in God's image. The first of these is through our ability to know love, love which is a participation in the divine because it comes from the divine. We are created in God's image. God is love. And in that, we are created with a capacity for that, which at its very essence comes from the same creator who created creation. In other words, we are all entitled to dignity, to respect, and to love. We must then respect life at all times, never compromising the dignity of anyone. Throughout Indian country, there are predators howling at the door, wolves with hungry teeth waiting to devour the very lifeblood of indigenous communities. Women and girls, life givers, nurturers, protectors, are being consumed by a sick form of evil which seeks to destroy the very wellspring of native life where it begins, the women, the source of all life. This is a continuation of those initial genocidal concepts that say if you take she who can give life to more natives out of the equation, you have less natives. As Colonel Shivington said before raiding the peaceful Southern Cheyenne village at Sand Creek in Colorado, when his soldiers asked if they were going to leave alive the women and children or whether they should kill them, his response was, "Nits make lice." Helen Betty Osborne, Tina Fontaine, Selena Not Afraid, Ashley Heavy Runner, Henny Scott, Hannah Harris, Okay, Sarah Stops Pretty Places, Lucinda Strong, and thousands upon thousands of murdered Indigenous women all shared a desire to achieve the things which filled their hearts, lifted their spirits, and spoke to goodness, beauty, and love. They were not mascots, princesses, squaws, and I sincerely hope we never use that term again. And they were not Pocahontas. They were human beings seeking to live their lives. And at some point, someone took their hope away. This is something we simply cannot tolerate. And so to discuss some of the ways in which there have been legislation and efforts to combat this issue, I turn it over to my colleague, Father Carson.
Thanks very much, Father Dave. I'm going to try and share my screen here. Okay, hopefully everybody can see that. I'm just going to go through the basics. Father Dave did an excellent presentation about what the statistics on why this is a big problem, not only human trafficking, but missing and murdered women in Indian country. So I'm just going to go back through some of the legal things, the challenges, but also why this is a big problem, and why it is increasing. So I'm just going to talk about why it's prevalent and why it's a big, why we have to think about Indian country as kind of a separate category of human trafficking and missing and exploited women, just because out of the statistics that Father Dave just said, it's one of the major problems in Indian country. Okay, first I'm going to talk about why anti-human trafficking programs must be adapted to Native cultures. Because human trafficking is so pervasive within Native communities, and also because it is a gateway to other crimes, such as the epidemic of murders, missing and exploited women, the tools to combat Native human trafficking as it remains is also important to be effective. And this is why we have to think about human trafficking and then try to apply it in terms of Native cultures. And it's not Native culture because there's many, many different cultures within the Native and Indigenous communities. Also, because many of the elements that make human trafficking such a pervasive problem and culture-based, the work and effort makes programs to be viable in Native communities is worth the work and effort. So it takes a lot of work to adapt these programs to combat human trafficking, but it's well worth the effort and the work to do that. And the first and most important steps is to invite Natives themselves, especially elders, to advise and guide the programs that deal with Natives. So we're going to develop a program that you have to invite people in to be part of that program, And especially my work with the Native communities, one of the most important part of Native communities is the elders of that community. Okay. We also are coming to language barriers, not only cultural barriers, but language barriers. It's not just most natives are English speakers, most of them are, but there are words and phrases that exist in native languages that have a hard time to being translated from the native language to English. It's not just the words, but meaning behind the words that are important. The best way to have a window in the culture is to start with the basic language. So you don't have to learn the native language yourself, but just to work with people who do know the language, so you can carry on that aspect of the cultures within their communities. Customs. One size does not fit all. Programs and initiatives that work on one culture will not work in a different culture. We certainly know that with the Native communities, that Native communities, our natives, are a lot different than Alaskan natives, as in Navajo in the Southwest. So you have to devise what you want to work with Native communities within the cultures. Further, there's not one Native culture, as I said. Natives are more like, you think about Natives, Indigenous, think about Europeans, that the Irish are a lot different than the Hungarians. And have to keep that in mind. There are vast differences in Native cultures depending on lands and tribes. Even tribes that live next to each other have very different historical narratives. I know the Hopi is, and they live within the Navajo reservation, the Navajo Nation, but they're very different cultures. The same with the Pueblos, they're very close to the Navajo, but they're very different cultures. Putting the work, the effort to adapt the outreach to vastly different Native communities is the only way to challenge human traffickers in the cycle of violence, especially against women and children. Okay, what else do you need to do? You need to get natives involved. If everyone do something about this pervasive problems, you just can't have a lot of people from Washington, D.C. or others just go into natives and say, Native communities and say, this is what we're going to do. We have to work with natives themselves, especially those who are involved with the cultures. There is a real aversion for many Native communities to talk to outsiders. They want to be listened to, they don't want to be talked to. And they know how to work within communities and can advise the best way to help with the communities. They just want some advice on how to do that and some resources. The response is far greater than natives. The response is far greater when natives are talking to natives, especially when we talk about personal stories or those who have been hurt or suffered from human traffickers. Another important resource is Native survivors of human trafficking. Survivors are the strongest weapons that we have to combat human trafficking, especially among Native Americans. Some victims assistance programs currently incorporate a peer-to-peer counseling model and often hire survivors and provide either some or all services to clients. Victims seek a non-judgmental support from those who have been in their situation before. Due to the high level of distrust that many natives have, with law enforcement or program, this peer-to-peer design is extremely beneficial and effective. A program to peer-to-peer counseling will provide victims the help they need, will gather information on other victims. Peer-led services reduce or remove the cultural barriers and language barriers that most victims of human trafficking experience when they try to communicate with those who educate about the trade between academic and professionals and law enforcement. So they're kind of the go-betweens. The victims of human trafficking realize what they've done, how they suffered, and now they can reach out to the wider community. Okay, let's go into the more specifically, the 10 reasons why human trafficking is so pervasive in Indian country. As Father David talked about, there's incredible statistics report that out of all the cultural families that we work with the USCCB, human trafficking is the #1 problem and concern with Native communities. And there's a lot of reasons for this, and let's go through them one by one. Okay, the first and most important reason is poverty. Poverty has 2 major effects. First, it adds the pressure on families and individuals in desperate situations to order to match their basic needs for survival. This is what human traffickers prey upon. Trying to find money for housing or food leads to taking chances that otherwise individuals would not think about. And so if you have a family that's starving or can't even make the basic needs, then the human traffickers see that and they prey upon that. Poverty also has an effect on Native communities. Policies are police and policies are underfunded because human trafficking requires a basic skill set. It's different than the normal police skill set. And then otherwise, then human trafficking does not become a priority for a law enforcement because they have so many other things that are higher priority, especially when they have limited resources. Further, funds or specialized training for both police and Native communities are largely unavailable with Native communities. And the number of police officers are limited because of funding, because of poverty. Another problem, overlapping police jurisdictions. There are 3 questions that must be answered to determine the appropriate police action or even the court action. First, whether the victim is a member of a federally recognized tribe or not. Whether the accused human trafficker is a member of a federally recognized Indian tribe or not. Whether the alleged offense took place on Indian tribe or not. All these questions have to be answered before the police can get involved and the courts can get involved. All these questions are not easy to answer. There are pivotal steps in determining investigation and then who's going to prosecute and how far they're going to prosecute. The Supreme Court largely stripped Indian net tribes of the ability to protect their people and to prosecute violent crimes committed against Indians on Indian land. However, through legislation, the policing, investigation, and prosecution of major felonies such as murder, manslaughter, kidnapping, maiming, incest, felony child abuse or neglect, arson, burglary, and robbery all belong to the federal government rather than the tribal police. Human trafficking was added to the list, but again, it's very limited. The person involved must be a member of the tribe in order for the federal authorities to get involved, and the tribal investigation is limited by the boundary of the tribe. So if you have a human trafficker who goes outside the tribe, then they can no longer be investigated by tribal police. Because jurisdictional inquiries are complex, there's often overlap in jurisdiction. The line the tribal authority ends and where federal and state authority begins is blurred. There's a historical lack in prosecution of crimes committed against Native Americans, especially by women on tribal lands. And this is true by the federal government, but also by the state government. Okay, let's continue. Another problem, isolation of many communities. Many reservations are very large and have very little population. I worked for 8 years on the Navajo Nation, and you could literally go 100 miles without seeing a house or with a car. They are huge. They're about the size of Connecticut, but a very small population. Okay, we have a large area and a very small population. We have 3 concerns. First concern, the sharing of information. Unlike information in urban areas, very small communities needs to be worked with, and this multiplies the cost of directing programs. If you have a lot of very small communities rather than one large community, the cost of developing program or even policing or prosecution is considerably more. Second, sharing of resources. Unfortunately, it's hard to develop programs and resources for a few amount of individuals who are highly isolated. The economy of scale is lost, lessened a little bit by technology, but technology also has less impact when many natives cannot afford the technology to begin with. Third, isolated communities often have a fear of outsiders. As stated before, isolated communities tend to become more insular. There also some natives might fear and be concerned about those who enter from outside the community, especially for those who do not trust. That's why it's very important to do outreach to include members of that community in planning, figure out how to enter, especially small tribal communities. Okay. Misinformation by human traffickers. Some criminals in human trafficking make the mistake of thinking that if they were not native, they cannot be arrested by tribal police and be prosecuted by tribal courts. That is not true, but that's a misconception. Both tribal courts can do prosecution of human traffickers. Recent laws have given tribal tribes more jurisdiction over crime and human trafficking, and also the federal system police, the criminal justice system seen human trafficking as a priority, and it's hopefully getting more of a priority. These facts have not persuaded criminals hold into the belief that they cannot be tried for illicit trade, and they continue to do it without fear of police or being prosecuted or being arrested for their crimes. The way to combat that is cross-deputization. Now, these are agreements between tribal police and state authorities and federal police, saying that we have a crime that can only be investigated by state police or by federal police, but then the federal police and state police give permission for the tribal police to go to a certain step of arresting and then handing it over to the state or federal police. These work actually. They're very. They kind of break the idea of the jurisdiction of who has jurisdiction anyway. We have the tribal police arresting somebody and then using these agreements and then following these agreements. That kind of cuts down all the blurred lines that we talked about earlier. However, these agreements, they require time and they have to be very specific. And a lot of tribes just don't do this because it requires a lot of time and a lot of effort. Okay, next reason. We have tribes that are close to both borders, the Canadian border and the Mexican border. Immigration is directly linked to human trafficking. Many reservations that are on both borders are a vast area and low population. Those involved in smuggling see reservations as an ideal place to hide drugs, weapons, and people, just because it was very vast and there's a very small police force. One might assume because Indigenous communities are not immigrant communities, not be affected by events on the border, but unfortunately, they oftentimes get entangled in the trafficking of people from the border because many traffickers take advantage of the closeness to reservation communities who are on the U.S. border. Okay, number 6, lack of information. Along with a lack of resources, there's also concern about lack of information. Only recent crime statistics are now gathered for information about missing, murdered Native women and human trafficking. I think Father David talked about that. It's only the last couple of years that we've had these statistics. One time, these statistics just weren't taken down, and then it took a lot of federal laws to make sure that these statistics are now gathered. The additional concern is sharing the information gathered. As stated before, human trafficking involves a number of different agencies, federal, state, and tribal. With many different agencies, information sometimes is not shared due to different technologies, judicial concerns, and even manpower. A congressional initiative, Title 9, sets out to improve the justice system for Native American women. Specifically, the title regulates the distribution of tribal funds, grants tribal law enforcement access to criminal database, creates a national tribal sex offender registry, and creates a registry for all protection orders issued by tribes. It's one way try to combat the problem with not having information when all 3 jurisdictions have the same information, or at least have access to the same information, then more crimes can be solved. Okay, we talked about this before, but it's very important. There's a lot of cultural barriers. Cultural barriers are not only including language, but also who do natives trust? How are natives perceived and the way information is shared? The most important way that cultural barriers hamper investigations is when the investigator are not trained in all aspects of native cultures. Keep in mind that one size does not fit all. Native cultures are different as European cultures. Being effective and being accepted in native communities hinges on the ability to adapt to outside of one's culture. Therefore, it's important to have native law enforcement, especially at federal level, working with native communities. It's important to have a native cultural 101 with all law enforcement, both state and federal, especially when those are working with human trafficking. Okay, lack of resources. So we talked about this before, but as stated, poverty has an effect on law enforcement itself. The scarcity of important technology, such as databases, specific individuals that are trained in human trafficking, and culturally appropriate programs to bring awareness of this issue are sadly lacking in most reservations. Further, a lack of resources limits the follow-up necessary for the victims of human trafficking for the mental, physical, and spiritual recovery. Programs may not be available for the important aftercare of victims. Okay, lack of training. Inadequate training on sexual violence and lack of understanding of tribal cultural norms affect tribal and state laws. Congress enacted the Violence Against Women Act, VAWA, in 1994. This act funds programs designed to improve criminal justice and community-based responses to violence action against women, including sexual violence. When Congress reauthorized it in 2013, expanded tribal communities' jurisdiction, especially over non-Indians commit violent crimes in Indian country. Oftentimes, criminal traffickers would do their crime, but then they move their victims outside the reservation, so tribal police cannot investigate. So the tribal police had to go to the federal or even state authorities. But again, this Title IX try to eliminate some of that. Title IX relating to tribal courts improve the justice system for Native American women. Specifically, Title IX regulates the distribution of tribal funds, grants tribal law enforcement access to criminal database, creates a national tribal sex offender registry, and creates a registry for all protective orders issued by tribes, as I said before. Okay, the last one. This is not only for a problem with natives and women in the native communities, but it's actually a big problem with all people dealing with human trafficking. And that's criminal charges against the victim, against the women and children who are the victims of human trafficking. One of the biggest problems, not only in any country, but nationally, is treating victims of human trafficking like criminals. This seriously prevents victims from coming forward. Already, children are considered victims no matter their circumstances. Criminal charges are not brought against those who are under the age of 18, no matter what. However, for adults, this is another story. Often human traffickers will use that knowledge and extortation in order to continue victimizing of others. So often human traffickers would threaten the victims, saying, if you come forward, then you're the one who's going to go put in jail and prison. And unfortunately, sometimes that is true. Laws are being changed both federally and at the state level and tribal level, but individual bias of laws enforcement plays a significant role in re-victimizing victims with criminal charges. Something, again, is a problem with not only natives, but also an entire field of human trafficking, and that is filing charges against the victims of human trafficking. Okay, that's what I have. Basically, I'm going to give it over to Felicitas. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Father Michael. That was very informative. I'm gonna share screen here. Can someone tell me, Father Michael, can you see it? Teresa, can you see it?
Yeah, I can see it. And I also want to remind people to post any kind of questions they have in the Q&A box too, and we'll get to those afterwards here in a few minutes.
Yeah, I'll go quick. So I'm going to talk a little bit about child trafficking on reservations. So kind of just identifying signs of trafficking, what that looks like, and especially children that are at very high risk in general, and specifically in Native American Indigenous reservations here in the U.S., especially since both Father Michael Carson and Father David just spoke a lot about this. So some common signs, which can be used and applied to adults as well, but I think that especially with children, there's specific signs here. So, limited or drastically reduced contact with family or friends, right? That part of isolation, someone other than a parent or guardian that controls what they do, where they go, even through intimidation through a cell phone or online, has unexplained injuries or bruises, works and lives in the same place, relationships with older men or older adults with like drastic age differences, secrecy, kind of hides where they go, where they are, can be sometimes have increase of sexual risky behaviors or substance use behaviors, chats online, truancy and tardiness from school, or like is disengaged in class, or is kind of missing out, or their grades are dropping and such things like that. So children have heightened risk factors so we're going to talk a little bit about their individual risk factors and kind of like family environment. So sex, age, disabilities, exposure to negative peer pressure, gangs, etc., You know, sex being female, you're more at high risk. I think Father David was saying how specifically from the age of 15 to 24, Native women are extremely at risk for being victimized. So then separation from family, that again, that like isolation, whether their family is isolating them or they are kind of isolating themselves, which can often lead to more involvement in child welfare programs and such, position within the family, discriminatory cultural practices, or just maybe gender roles, what that looks like in the family dynamic system, ignorance and kind of sometimes being naive by being young and thinking they are maybe older than they are, or if they are treated that way. So family risk factors, it's always really complicated because it kind of contradicts itself, right? Like having a single parent or a small family could be a risk, but also having a large household could be a risk as well, because sometimes when people are with big family systems, not everyone might be directly from the nuclear family, or it could be focusing on other people in the family versus that child. Insufficient income, you know, financial insecurities are always a big risk, just in general, specifically in situations of trafficking in which people can sometimes profit. Illnesses or death in the family, just kind of immediate shocks to the system. Power relationships, right? Like what the gender roles are there again. You know, who is the authority figure, who's kind of leading the family system there. Family violence, discriminatory traditional cultural practices, preferences for male, female child, and of course, recent migration that can often apply to some, you see a lot of Indigenous communities from other countries that are kind of migrating here to the US and the southern border. And so I thought that was a prevalent topic. And I wanted to mention here, ACEs, for those that don't know, are called adverse childhood experiences, in which individuals are more, specifically in childhood, the more exposure there are to multiple ACEs, the more likely that there will be long-term mental health issues or just issues that go into adulthood, or will be more at risk for certain substance use behaviors or risky behaviors. That could be like sexual, violent, or substance use behaviors. And some ACEs include domestic violence, parental abandonment, a parent with a mental health condition, being a victim of abuse, neglect, or violence, seeing a lot of abuse, neglect, or violence in your home or in your community, seeing or having a family member that is in prison, and growing up in a household where there is heavy substance use, alcohol or drug use. So some community risk factors, which they all kind of mesh together. So you see community violence, gangs, under-resourced school, when there's limited educational opportunities and, you know, a lot of peers are dropping out of high school or out of school, youth overemployment, along with youth underemployment, when there's very little opportunity for success or for jobs or for just academia, lack of safe entertainment outlets, community centers, those recreational centers, parks, things that kind of bring communities together or safe places. As Father Michael was talking about, kind of like the tension between local community and policing and local authority. So you see a lot of the jurisdictional issues within tribal nations, and kind of what that looks like when you have, you know, the federal government here in the United States, and the differences and the discrepancies of and lack of collaboration kind of with tribal authorities, and kind of what that leads and has clearly been proven and shown that it's not efficient, and it's putting people more at risk. Weak protection systems, child protection systems, foster care, transitional housing, supports, things like that, especially for young adults, people that are individuals that might be aging out of foster care, and what that looks like post that age, depending the state you're in. Sometimes it's 18, sometimes it's 21. And so, you know, kind of what systems are in place to continue supporting children that are involved in the child welfare system, and how to kind of get them out. Oftentimes people that are involved in foster care or with the child welfare system that age out of foster care are, they have very high chances of being homeless, and ethnic groups heighten those risk factors, such as Native American individuals. Community leadership, power structures, kind of some regular information. And so what are some action items to kind of reduce child vulnerability? I think Father Michael was talking about this need of needing to collaborate and being sensitive to the community that we are talking to. So having these open communications, not only with the environment, but specifically with children, kind of educating children on these on the issue of human trafficking, you know, teaching people how they can be victims and helping them understand and develop healthy coping skills, emotional regulation skills, providing age-appropriate educational, social, economic opportunities, creating safe spaces in which they can share this information if they do feel that they are at risk or if they're uncomfortable or anything that could kind of lead an individual to being exploited. So child trafficking on reservation statistics. So there was a couple of research that I was reading, and a lot that kind of hits in very specific areas. But in 2011, a study of Native American individuals in Minnesota revealed individuals that were sexually exploited had revealed that majority of them had been abused as children by an average of 4, but 4 times likely than men, and then were tricked into the sex trade with no understanding of what they were getting themselves into. So they were 4 times more likely to be abused as children sexually, and then were kind of misled and misinformed into what they were getting themselves into, and evidently were exploited. Another study by the Los Angeles public health officials in 2014 showed that fear and violence ultimately created an emotional bond with perpetrators. And so a lot of times you'll hear throughout conversations in human trafficking that individuals will refer to their perpetrator or their trafficker as their boyfriend or as their friend or as kind of someone that they're maybe romantically involved with, like an intimate partner. And a lot of times there's some trauma bonding that takes place in which individuals will create these emotional bonds. And so it's difficult to kind of get out of these situations. In South Dakota, a state with lots of open space, as Father Michael was mentioning, and places to kind of hide and sneak, you know, maybe be hard to identify because you can go, you know, miles without seeing a house or seeing some people. It's hard to, a lot of local supporters will claim that trafficking is a low risk crime in which there's just not enough people to kind of, you know, see it or to identify it. And tribal police have very little resources and have a very significant caseloads and a lot of work on demand. So oftentimes things are given priorities over others, especially with, again, you know, having so much space and having such a little population. It seems to be a low risk crime while many individuals are being perpetrated. I know previously we were talking about the lack of underreporting nature of the crime and what that looks like. And here, you know, you can see that it is labeled as a low risk crime when in fact it really isn't. So those are some things to point out. Here you see authorities, you know, may refrain from taking action, lack of proof, victims, it's really hard for victims to come forward. And there's a lot of kind of risk factors there, lack of trust with law enforcement, lack of supports, and especially children. There are very unique bonds that children have in respect for authority and lack of information sharing, privacy, and just different areas in which children can be even more victimized. So to kind of finish everything off, some action items. And I'm sure we can share all these PowerPoints with anyone that is interested in kind of having them. But so teaching yourself and others, again, kind of relating to that part of how to decrease risks, educating kids about their rights. I think that's a very powerful and impactful way for a child to feel, you know, empowered and know what can be right and wrong or how they can be victimized. Encouraging preventative initiatives. Father Michael was touching on this, and, you know, finding multidisciplinary approaches to help communities and to focus on the direct needs of those individuals and tailor the specific, you know, the cultural appropriations, the language, the issues, the barriers, terminology, all these kinds of things. Identifying child maltreatment, a really good way of decreasing maltreatment is if people are aware of what maltreatment looks like. You know, PSAs are a great way to kind of discuss and point out what abuse may look like, whether it's emotional, physical, and sexual, and kind of giving a lot of points for people to kind of understand what child maltreatment would look like, whether that's in your immediate home, in your immediate circle, in your schools, in your workforce, kind of all around. Know the warning signs, you know, what are some indicators of maltreatment? What are some indicators of someone that could be exploited? And of course, always reporting in a lot of different ways. You know, sexual abuse is a mandated report. Most states would consider it to be a mandated report, and any child abuse and neglect would also kind of be something to always report. And if you're ever in doubt, please do report, because someone can always be exploited in different ways. So someone once told me, if you ever have to think if you should be reporting something, you probably should be. And so that's always a good sign. And protecting children, I think, is a vital role, especially in these extremely vulnerable communities. So some other information here, we have a couple of links that are in the PowerPoint that if this is shared, you guys can access them. But so there's a great organizations that are doing some fights against human trafficking, both at the local and national level, specifically within Native American communities. There's a lot of organizations that focus on missing and murdered women and children, a couple that focus on sexual exploitation, and just different varieties of what this looks like. There's a new documentary called Bring Her Home that follows 3 Indigenous women, which one's an activist, a politician, and an artist, as they work together to honor the victims of missing and murdered Indigenous women. It's always a great way to educate yourself and kind of find new ways to learn about the issues going on. Sister Teresa Wolf, that is on this call, actually just sent me this documentary video. I don't know if you can see it, but it's called Reach, and it's to end sex trafficking in Native American communities. So this is another great film that kind of talks on this issue. Supporting your local parishes, organizing food drives, supply pantries, or just finding other supplies. Teresa Flores here, she does something called the Soap Project, which is a unique way of kind of bringing awareness on on topics of human trafficking. There's a lot of unique ways to do that for your specific communities, such as Native American communities, and reaching out to nonprofits. And some of the programs we have here at USCCB, such as Become a Shepherd, focus on empowering local parishes and uplifting and having lay religious leaders kind of support the issue here on human trafficking and educate. And then just some book recommendations that talk about Father Michael Carson and Father David Bailey and I were all talking about all these great books that kind of talk a lot, not just about issues on reservations, but specifically just on the history of Native American and Indigenous communities. And they're always great reads to be educated on this population. And that's all I have.
Thank you so much. There is another book too that I would recommend, Carnival Lights by Christine Stark.
Yeah.
She is a survivor, and though it's a fiction book, I learned quite a lot by her book. So I'll include some of those resources in our follow-up email that everybody will get. I have a few questions. We only have a few minutes, so
Okay.
oh, she said, what was the movie that was recommended but not on the list? Was that Reach?
Yeah, it's this one. It's Reach, and it's to end sex trafficking in Native American communities.
Nice. I will definitely get some links for those books
Yeah.
and too for everybody. So this one is a really interesting one. It's been in the news a lot lately. Recent Vatican, and I don't know how to say that word, repudiation of the doctrine of discovery. Is it relevant to the crime of human trafficking and exploitation of Indigenous women and children today? Maybe fathers, one of you guys can answer that.
Do you want to take it, David, or do you want me to?
Well, I was thinking you would, but I can as well. I think it's relevant for a lot of the reasons that I was talking about, insofar as how we view Indigenous people in this hemisphere. There's this idea of arrogance that is transferred when one nation or groups are multiple.
Oops. I don't know if he froze or I froze.